It's very good to be here and to be also the capstone speaker for this year. I'm going to talk about the topic of my book, but much more broadly about the Muslim world, about the United States' perspective on the Muslim world, relations with the Muslim world, where do we go from here with the Muslim world. Now, for much of the past decade since the events of 9/11, we've thought a lot about the Muslim world. It's been in our media. It's become part of the language of our politics. It's mattered a lot to us. And the thinking often is that the United States or the West and the Muslim world are not on the right path. They're not on the same page. And we've thought a lot about how to fix that relationship and how to particularly think about righting those things that we think are not going right in the Muslim world. And in that context, probably nothing worries us more in the West than the question of extremism and the perception that the Muslim world is thinks too much about conservative ideas and is too permissive towards extremism, and that this is something that is going to be a threat or a major foreign policy concern. Now, much of that is quite true. Namely, extremism is an issue of paramount concern. It is a foreign policy consideration. It has become, for rightly or wrongly, a major focus of U.S. foreign policy. And to that extent, it has also become the way in which, by and large, many Americans, many in the West, view the Muslim world. But there is also sometimes a tendency that it becomes too all-consuming. It becomes something that becomes the only thing that matters when we think about the Muslim world. And it also reduces every political, religious trend of 1.3 billion people in an area stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific under one, if you would, consideration. Now, my beginning point is that as important as extremism or as conservatism, as fundamentalism has been and is to the Muslim world and to the concerns that the United States and the West have about the Muslim world, it is not the only thing that is happening that is deserving of our attention in the Muslim world. And in fact, those other things, most important of which is some of the economic factors I'll talk about, that we don't pay attention to or we're not overtly concerned with, will in the end be the solution to the things that we are very concerned with. I mean, if we thought about a lot of the discussion in this country about the Muslim world, it's been about how do you get the Muslims to think differently about their own religion, about the world, about the West. How do you get them to move away from conservative ideas or supportive extremism towards so-called moderation, coexistence with the West? And if that's really the goal or objective, some of the other trends that we're not thinking about are much more important. Now, in my opinion, economics is a very big issue. We often don't think in terms of economics about the Muslim world. There's some things that we understand intuitively. We understand that there is a relationship between poverty and extremism. We think that that when you have poverty, where you have lack of opportunity, that it translates into circumstances that leads people to support extremism. Among at least the more sophisticated observers of the Muslim world, they also understand that the problem has to do with the way in which things are done in the Muslim world. Namely, in too many places, you have government-controlled economies that are not really growing anymore, that the government controls too many things, it's not able to provide jobs, it's not able to provide opportunity for the population, it's providing less and less of services, that's water, education, sanitation, basic services. And then you look at the demographics of the Muslim world, where in country after country, in excess of 65% of the population, sometimes even more, are categorized as youth. Now, just having that many young people is trouble in of itself, let alone if there is no job market that would actually be able to absorb them or provide them a path to a better life or upward mobility. I mean, these things we understand, even though they don't dominate our discussion about the Muslim world. We understand that these problems exist. So, but when we think this in this way, we think that the solution to the Muslim world is development, is aid, is job creation. It's essentially helping the bottom of the society in order to stabilize it, provide it with some opportunity. Now, this is important, but this is not the kind of economics issues that I have in mind. If we looked at the Muslim world, and you ask many Americans what is distinctive about the Muslim world, they probably tell you they're too religious, or they're too anti-Western, or they're too extremist. But there's also true that large parts of the Muslim world sit outside of the global economy, that they're not integrated into the global economy. And by that, I don't mean that people in the Muslim world don't sell things to the West, and they don't buy things from us. What I mean is that large part of the Muslim world are not part of the globalization supply chain, by which I mean that when we think about other areas of the world like East Asia or Latin America or Eastern Europe, those economies produce things that are components to things that are built elsewhere and then are built elsewhere and ultimately are things that you and I buy. But I mean, if you went to Walmart today, you don't find too many things that says made in the Arab world on it. There are not too many components, too many things that have components that are built in the Arab world. Yes, we do trade with many parts of the Muslim world. So we buy oil or we buy agricultural products and they buy finished goods from us. But that does not mean that those economies are actually participating in the global economy in the manner that, say, Brazilian, Argentinian, Korean, and these other economies do. Now, that's a very important factor. In other words, when we talk about a globalized world in which large parts of the world is integrated economically into one another, that production, trade, etc., creates relationships and networks between people. Sitting outside of that global economic web does have consequences. And those consequences, I think, have a lot to do with the reality on the ground in the Muslim world in very profound ways. One of the most important consequences that it has is that many parts of the Muslim world lack, if you would, a middle class that would essentially be the anchor of society culturally, politically, and economically. Now, why does the middle class matter? If we thought about the history of the West itself, which we often preach to the Muslim world that it ought to copy and it ought to follow, we often think that what matters most in the West that is relevant to the Muslim world is the Protestant Reformation, that it's Luther that the Muslims should look for. In other words, somebody who comes and changes religious doctrine. I disagree. I think the Muslims need a David Hume and an Adam Smith. They don't need a Luther. If you looked at European history, if you looked at where Protestantism originally arose, if you thought about Calvin's Geneva or Scotland under the early Protestants, Scotland in the early Reformation period would be something like Taliban's Kabul. It was a highly puritanical, rigid, and intolerant place where children were executed for not observing religion properly. Now, what happened that this Scotland became the seat of the Industrial Revolution, that it produced such luminaries as David Hume and Adam Smith? It was not because of a religious reformation, but it was because of rise of trade and commerce. It was because of capitalism. It's capitalism that made the West in many ways into what it is, and it's capitalism that the Muslim world in that sense requires. Now, the class that essentially drove this in the West was a middle class that was rooted in markets and was rooted in commerce and trade. Now, when I speak, often people say, well, you know, there is a middle class in the Arab world, there's a middle class in Iran, or there's a middle class here and there. But what we mean by middle class, it doesn't just mean a sort of a relatively affluent, relatively prosperous middle of society. What we mean is essentially that middle of society that is tied to market forces.